It is now 6 months since that initial Hamas terrorist attack back on October the 7th. I do want to get into some potentially big news on this important date. I want to put up this tweet right now from Jonathan Schanzer saying Israel news is filled with reports that the IDF is withdrawing a division, leaving just one brigade in Gaza. And he says, I don't understand how withdrawal leads to victory. So for more on this, let's bring in Jonathan Schanzer, the vice president there at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us here on this Sunday. And I think a lot of people may try to correlate the Biden-Netanyahu call with what's going on with this withdrawal. Can you kind of detail what this withdrawal was and potentially are there any correlations?
Well, I think absolutely this is the result of pressure coming from the White House. We have seen a war of words, if you will, between Biden and Netanyahu. It's been going on now for the last month or so. Initially, the thinking was that this is related to Ramadan, but that month is about to come to an end, and Israel didn't stop fighting during that time period. But what we're looking at now is, I think, something different. First of all, I think there is a last-ditch effort, and you were just watching Yair Lapid, the head of the Israeli opposition, talking about bringing home the hostages. There appears to be a last-ditch effort to try to get those hostages back. They are about 135 total individuals that are being held by Hamas. The number that are still alive, we're really not sure. I've heard different reports. I'm sure that they're not all alive. I think we'd be lucky if 3/4 of them were. But there is, I think, a desperate effort on the part of the Israelis. It's been one of their war aims to get them back. And so, maybe acquiescing to some of Hamas's demands, pulling out of the Rafah area, which is where the vast majority of Hamas's fighters are held. That may be one piece of this. Another piece of it is the humanitarian concerns. And of course, we know what happened with the World Central Kitchen last week. And we also know that there are about 1.4 million Palestinians that are in Rafah right now. And the president of the United States would like them to be evacuated before a war begins. So from what we understand out of Israel today, the Israelis have pulled out an entire division. They've left a brigade there to make sure that Hamas does not overrun central or northern Gaza. They're giving time for negotiations to play out, and hopefully what we'll see is maybe a month or so that would bring the evacuation of those displaced persons so that Israel could go back in and finish the job. Whether Israel's given that green light or not from the president remains to be seen, but certainly I think the president would not mind having a little bit of political breathing room as he takes heat from the progressive left within his party. I think he'd like a couple weeks off from getting hammered by his own.
Yeah, and you mentioned the pressure there, which potentially led to this initial withdrawal. And of course, they kind of drew a line, a lot of what ifs or what happens next if they don't change kind of the tone, change what happens, launching that investigation as well. Is this just the beginning of a trend, a tone shift in Israel in relation to this? Could we see more withdrawals in the near future?
I don't know if the Israelis can withdraw entirely from the Gaza Strip. I think that they're going to have to keep forces there, at least for right now, to make sure that Hamas can't reconstitute. Now, you can do that through special operations. You can do that through basically just sustained minimal pressure to ensure that Hamas doesn't come back resurgent. But I do think that we should not be under any illusions here. The Israelis are still at war. So they still have a lot of targets that they have yet to hit inside the Gaza Strip, and they have their war aims, which is, in fact, the destruction of Hamas. Whether that happens in 3 weeks, 3 months, or 3 years, I don't think the Israelis are going to forget the October 7th events anytime soon. And they will be looking to take out the leadership of Hamas and to try to destroy those remaining brigades. The other thing that I think is probably worth noting here is that the Hezbollah in the north of Israel, out of Lebanon, they continue to wage a war against Israel. They've been doing it since October 8th. They've attacked Israel somewhere between 2,500 to 2,800 times, missiles, drones, rockets, you name it. The Israelis are not going to stop fighting there either. And there actually is, I'd say, still a pretty decent chance, an alarmingly good chance, that a war could break out in the north and Israel could just essentially decide to leave the remainder of Hamas for another day. This is potentially inevitable so long as Hamas continues to fire these rockets into northern Israel. They've vacated a significant strip across the north of the country. Something like 100,000 Israelis are no longer able to live in their homes. That is not something that the Israelis are going to deal with lightly. And then there's the last part of this, which is that after that attack that Israel launched against that senior IRGC commander in Damascus just about a week ago, there is now the potential for direct confrontation between Israel and Iran. So while we are hearing that there may be at least a little bit more calm returning to the Gaza Strip, that does not mean the absence of conflict in other places. And you have to remember, all of these groups, whether it's Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, etc., they are all funded, trained, and armed by Iran. This is the wider war. And if the wider war goes in that direction, we will be in uncharted territory. We haven't seen anything quite like this really since the Islamic Republic was founded.
Yeah, they're all kind of interconnected, even though they're in different fronts, and the focus may shift a little bit as well. You also mentioned a term I think a lot of people will talk about in Rafah as well, and you also mentioned the fact that these withdrawal might open some conversations for hostages and whatnot. And the U.S. has also mentioned that they want to be in talks with Israel about a potential invasion of Rafah as well. In terms of this withdrawal, does that maybe increase the invasion of Rafah for Israel, or does that change at all?
Well, I think right now when you talk about the withdrawal, they're withdrawing from an area that they've cordoned off around Rafah primarily. I mean, they were sitting there ready to roll. They still have some fighters in the north and in central Gaza, there's no question about it, but this looks like they're easing up on Rafah for now. Rafah, I think it's worth noting here is you could say the Israelis are essentially on the 5-yard line here with this war. They have conquered 95% of the Gaza Strip. What's remaining right now is this town of Rafah, which sits right on the Egyptian border, and the Israelis are essentially being told to stand down. They refused to do that for the last 3 or 4 weeks, and now it appears that they are ready to do it. But I think the big question is, if they start moving some of these displaced people out of Rafah, what that does is it opens up the window for the Israelis to later go back in. If they don't do that, then that might mean that they've just punted on a Rafah operation. But with that, I think we're going to have to just wait and see. I am hearing from the Israeli side that their determination has not changed one iota, that they're still committed to destroying Hamas, and that they need to give Biden some time and they need to give the displaced persons some time. By the way, the Israelis need some time to reset. They want to rest that division they've pulled out. They've been fighting for months now on end. The Israelis need to probably acquire some different kinds of munitions for the fight that they want to wage. Very precise munitions, which of course will come from the U.S., and there's been some discomfort there. So there's going to be, I think, a bit of give and take going on between Israel and the U.S., and I think the Israelis, like I said, they're going to try to give some time for the hostage negotiations to play out. They're going to give Biden a couple of weeks to reset ties with his own party. And then I think, if I'm reading the tea leaves right, in about a month from now, you'll see that final battle for the entirety of Gaza, with the epicenter being in Rafah. That battle could take 2 weeks to a month. So with any luck, this whole thing could be over in about 2 months' time. But lots of things have to happen before we get to that final point.
A lot for that to line up, and we've been fighting for 6 months, like you mentioned as well. You also mentioned that Biden potentially threatens to withhold military aid as well, and the U.S. has said that they will have their assessment on both the investigation into the World Central Kitchen, but also other things as well. Maybe what goes into that assessment by the Biden administration, by the White House, by the U.S. government about what's going on in Israel as well? And do you think if they don't meet standards, will the U.S. actually withhold military aid?
This is one of those things that I have to say strikes me as somewhat bizarre. We know that the Israelis have been allowing for massive numbers of trucks to come through. bearing aid for the people of Gaza. We know for a fact that Hamas is diverting a lot of that aid. We know that they are keeping it for themselves. We know that they are selling it to the population rather than allowing them to have it to supplement some of their own income and to, build out that war chest. We know that the Israelis admitted that they made a grievous error with the strike that occurred on that World Central Kitchen. We know that the Israelis have apologized for it, and then we know that they are working with their partners who've been delivering aid to try to make sure that those things don't happen again. But of course, we all know that in war zones, these are complex situations. There are mistakes that take place. Of course, the United States has had plenty of those kinds of mistakes in war zones like Iraq and Afghanistan. This has been the rule, not the exception. So holding the Israelis to account for that makes sense, but punishing them by withholding weapon systems makes no sense at all, specifically because the U.S. is providing a lot of those very targeted munitions that Israel needs in order to make sure that mistakes don't happen, right? Yeah. So there's a lot going on here where I think it's a lot of virtue signaling. I do believe that this is the president trying to speak to his base, showing his base that he's getting tough on Israel because that base, that progressive left, the youth within the party, they are not comfortable with this. He's looking at a couple of swing states, purple states like, Michigan or Pennsylvania, and he's trying to make sure that they're getting the message loud and clear that he is reining in Israel, as it were. I don't think Israel needs to be reined in, but if that's the message, so be it. And I think, at least from what I can tell, the Israelis are playing along with this right now with the idea that perhaps the president will give them the green light that they need in order to finish the war that he promised that he would help them win. Correct. So it's an interesting dynamic to watch, to put it mildly.
Yeah, so many complexities in war as well as just complexities on this withdrawal, whether it's strategic, whether it was political. There's just so many different layers as well to it. Jonathan Schanzer, thank you so much for joining us 6 months in right now into this war in Israel. Any parting words, any more thoughts you want to share with our audience that we might not have gotten to yet?
Look, I would just only say this, that, we need to remember that this is a bigger war between Israel and Iran. That is the thing I mentioned earlier, but that is the thing that is driving all of this. The Iranians trained Hamas to do what they did on 10/7. They trained Hezbollah to do what they've been doing since the war began. They trained the Houthis and armed the Houthis, and they're the ones that have shut down all that traffic in the Red Sea. They trained the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria and they're the ones that killed 3 of our service members, American service members from the Georgia National Guard back in late January. This is the battle that's underway. When the president of the United States lashes out against Israel for responding to these aggressors and by responding to Iran itself, it's undermining the American-led world order. That ultimately right now, yes, I understand there's tension within the Democratic Party between Israel and the United States, between Biden and Bibi, but that tension, it cannot be emphasized above the broader war aims that we all need to be looking at right here. This is a serious moment with Iran activating multiple proxies across the region in a war that it is directing. And if the U.S.-Israel relationship suffers as a result of this, I shudder to think about what it means for the rest of the region. It's also worth noting that, we're not exactly keeping things calm or stable in Ukraine. We're fearful of what may come in Taiwan. The rest of the world is watching, and it will be important for the U.S. to uphold its alliance and to sustain a modicum of order in the Middle East.
Yeah, order is going to be tough to come by there. Of course, Jonathan Schanzer, thank you so much. We're going to keep our focus on all of these fronts, all of these different international headlines as well. We appreciate your time, your insight, your perspective here on Live Now.